Sunday, the 7th of May, welcome to the Fourth Estate. Here are the stories that we'll be covering from our homes today. Today on the show, we talk to Arnold Segal, who's just hot off the press in covering the State of the Nation address. We talk about the hits and misses that the press and the media in general had about the coverage of the State of the Nation address. And we also talk prospectively about how the press should behave covering the budget. At every start of a government year, the president of the country is required by law to go to parliament and deliver what is called the State of the Nation address. The address is majorly meant to encompass what the president has been able to do and what they want to do in the coming year. That address kickstarts off a very new year for parliament. This week, the press covered the State of the Nation address for the first time digitally. The address was delivered on Zoom from State House in NTV to members of parliament who were seated at the parliament building. We talked to Arnold Segal about the hits and misses of the press in covering the State of the Nation address.
If somebody with the letter scoffs.
Unlike any other of his speeches, the State of the Nation address is an instrument of the law. It is, in the annals of constitutional governance, a bedrock for accountability for a mandate that the executive gets from a population, and it's delivered to the legislature, which is the representation of the masses. Uganda's State of the Nation is thus an important point of focus for the media. Before delivering this address, however, the president had delivered 15 separate addresses on the COVID-19 pandemic, and the press had latched onto the hangover, which denied them a critical look at this address. Could it have been covered better? What were the hits and the misses? This week, we speak to Arnold Segal, an anchor with NTV, about the coverage of the State of the Nation.
This is sort of a statutory address where the president comes and speaks not only in the framework of the present, but draws a lot in retrospect. What do I mean? Kind of give you a sense of this is what the parliament passed in terms of a fiscal sense, a budgetary kind of thinking. And this is how the country has progressed, let's say, in the past financial year. Now, that sense of accountability is something that is very, very crucial and goes to, in a sense, reaffirm the relevance and the position of our commander in charge. And that's definitely something that we wanted to look at very, very seriously, press-wise, definitely at NTV and Daily Monitor. And something else that we were looking at is definitely COVID-19 is here. And how are we realigning the Ugandan economy to make sure that we can weather the storm? It's here, yes, it is, but are we realigning it to make sure that there's a word that's flying around a whole lot, real economy, to make sure that this real economy is actually going to weather the storm? Now, these were two questions that I would say double-pronged. I was very, very keen to hear addressed, and regarding how NTV covered this, wow, I would say it was close to 6 hours of coverage. Emmanuel Mutaiziwa, of course, Josephine Karunji, yourself, Raymond, you were there, I was there. Malcolm Musime was also part of it, not forgetting Jamagiro, to just give us an out-of-studio kind of understanding and unpacking of the State of the Nation address, but also very, very keenly what the people are expecting out of it.
The impression that many people get when they're watching the State of the Nation address is that the press has had a sort of indoor experience. Talk to cabinet members so you know what's coming. And many people think that the press knows almost 80% of the president's address before it happens. So they're looking forward for a level of context to that kind of speech. Did you feel that the media offered the public the best context they could get out of the speech that the president gave?
That's a bit of a tough one, because on one end, the following day, the Daily Monitor, that's yesterday, because the State of the Nation was on Thursday. So Friday, the Daily Monitor has a very, very fascinating front page, which offers quotes in a very retrospective sense from 2016 to 2019, just giving us a sense of this is what the president said in 2016, 2017, 18, 19, and you do kind of see a recurring theme. You do see some words that come up often, maybe in the past few years. You see things like import substitution, which is still a song that is being sung now. Now, does the press have a backstage pass to maybe what is to be expected? I would say no, because Harvard Ziwa, who's a parliamentary reporter at NTV, was stationed at the parliament. And this was even a big fixture for them too. They sat down religiously, they listened to the head of state, they listened to what he had to say, and after that they had to make comments. So this gives you a very wide grasp of how serious a State of the Nation address is. There's a lot that the president does touch, not only as a president, but also the defense and the peace and the security side of things is a very, very sensitive matter that is addressed in a State of the Nation address. Let's not forget that the president is a general himself. Now, these are not matters that you and I, ordinary civilians, can just wake up and address, or even members of parliament who are not part of the security committee. So many of us are quite oblivious to that side of things. And definitely you would want to take heed, listen to what the commander-in-chief has to say in that particular direction. So to answer your question, definitely even us, the people in the press, we were oblivious to many of, we don't have a backstage pass to many of these things. We only anticipate, and then we can react to what is offered to us as the news.
In terms of the way now that the speech was delivered and reported on, the president sort of split the country across economic lines and said there's a country that lives in the real economy and another country that lives in an economy that feeds off the real economy. And he sort of just addressed himself to the real economy. Was it fair that the press let him go on this? Because the next day, all the headlines that we saw didn't sort of capture the anxiety that people were facing in all sides of the economy, whether you were in the real economy or the unreal economy, as the president talked about.
I would beg to differ. Again, this is a sort of a philosophical argument, because let me give you two things, pay as you earn and value-added tax. Now, someone like Raymond, who maybe is on a salary, is going to pay as you earn. But over 65% of the ordinary Ugandan is in the informal sector. These are people who wake up, maybe they do welding, maybe someone is selling airtime, is doing mobile money on the street, and they are not particularly paying pay as you earn. They're not particularly into the pension sector. And it's very, very keen to recognize that they, on the other hand, are paying value-added tax. When they buy a soda, they're paying value-added tax. Now, for you to wake up and draw a very thick line between the real economy, quote unquote, and the other side, which I will not give a name, it would be very unfair, because at the end of it all, there's things that cut across. There's taxes that do fall on each one of us in a very, very indirect manner. Some of them are very, very direct. And guess what? They affect the guy in Aguru, they affect the guy in Nansana, they affect the guy in the corner of Chenjojo. So for you to look at it in such a manner, I would say is a bit short-sighted, and that shouldn't be the way, especially if you're thinking in terms of stimuli, you know, and kickstarting an economy. You cannot think on one side of the fence at the expense of the other. This has to be kind of a broad-based approach. That's the difference between the likes of China, which have managed to lift over 300 million people out of poverty in less than 30 years, and a country like maybe the United States, where a president comes in and he offers the Wall Streeters even less taxes, he offers the big banks even less taxes. So it gives you, again, I don't want to decide for anyone, but it just gives you a sense of where should your critical thinking be lying.
Arnold, I want us to focus on the media reporting of the president's speech after it was done. A lot of the public relied on the media first of all, to put this speech into context, the president was giving a State of the Nation after he'd addressed the country almost 18 times in the last 3 months about COVID-19. So there was a hangover of the president's speeches. But the State of the Nation is not an everyday speech. It's an instrumental speech that he gives before Parliament to account for what he's done. And in any case, it is the last speech in his mandate. Many would have thought this is the speech that captures what the president has been able to do in the 5-year mandate he was given and what he's plotting for the future of the country. Listening back to that speech yourself, and I know you can wear an editor's hat, did you feel like this speech offered that criticism of these are my 5 years, this is what I've done with them, and this is what I think that the country will be able to move to?
For me, the biggest criticism came around the pay as you earn. Now, some countries just across the border, they've cut down pay as you earn by around 2 percentage points. And what this means is the ordinary folk who are earning, let's say in the formal sector, have less pressure because, let's face it, many of us are actually having to endure cuts in terms of salaries, and even wages are actually being cut, they're being revised. So if this is subject to a pay-as-you-earn tax because you are actually earning, at a time like this kind of payment shouldn't be deferred, because a deferment means that at some point it's going to come back in play. Now, if you defer it for maybe 3 months, that's what we're seeing, and that's not a reason to celebrate, because upon a time T, then the government, then the fiscal body, then the body that collects taxes is going to come back and claim. So that is not a reason to celebrate. That is just something that is pushed further. So that is one thing that I think should have been very, very heavily scrutinized. What we needed was not a deferment of some of these taxes. In CFA, in financial language, what we should have needed is a deferred tax asset. Hypothetically, if I, Arnold, here, pay an excess of taxes to the Uganda Revenue Authority in this financial year, and we get to the next financial year, I then have, because I paid an excess in the previous financial year, in the next financial year, I would have a deferred tax asset. That means that the revenue body owes me money, and that is an asset. In this particular kind of arrangement, what we needed to hear, because this is a stimulus, quote unquote, was the government offering the ordinary folk, the government offering manufacturers, the government offering producers a tax asset to say that it's not good enough that you will, we are already offering to waive the taxes for this particular period. But in the next period, as you recover, how about we give you a deferred tax asset? Then we would know that this is a stimulus. But this, as it stands right now, China had to go on, the whole Chinese economy went on and cut value-added tax by around a percentage point. Have we cut value-added tax? No, we've not. Our fuel is as expensive, airtime is as expensive, and all of this is passed on to you and I, the consumer. Because if more levies are put onto voice or data bundles, the telecom companies are going to do the simplest thing they ever do. Oh, we've raised our rates. They pass it on to you. So they get their profit, they get their margin at the end of the day, and they just pass it on to you. So what I needed from the media was a keen understanding of the words. You need to appreciate 2 words. One is waive, the other is defer. If you're deferring, you're just passing it on to the next period. If you waive, maybe then we're talking about forgiveness for that particular time T. So those are 2 things that the media should have scrutinized very, very keenly, and I personally did not see.
Away from that, and I noticed that you talk about the taxes. We just received 2 weeks before this address the results from the revenue body. and that indicated that they'd failed to collect close to 48% of the revenue that they anticipated to collect. That's a huge blow. It's a really huge blow. So government had a very small envelope to work with. Do you think that the media did enough in terms of putting into context how much money government was working with to be able to offer a stimulus package of a certain nature? And
right.
also, that there's broad public reporting of all this debt that were contracted because of COVID-19. So people might have been anticipating that for all the revenue that we lost, we got back in debt. Is that how it should have been reported?
That's quite interesting. I think the one thing that I've realized about our coverage of debt issues is a very, very keen emphasis on external debt at the expense of internal debt and domestic debt, as the right technical word is. And if we're to look at our keen appreciation of Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the other guys, the Paris Club, quote unquote, we're very keen on them. China, no exception. And just the other day, when the Paris Club members offer us a debt facility, we jump onto that as the media very, very religiously. But how many treasury bills have been issued by, let's say, Bank of Uganda? How many bonds are we looking at? How many 5-year? How many 15? These are things that we need to take in context. And you do raise a very interesting point on whether or not we actually, as the media, appreciated this particular gap that URA came out and flagged. Now, do you even start in even a marginal way to say that URA has a tough job? I would say they have the toughest job among all of us. But as it stands right now, I don't think we did enough to appreciate the tax gap, the tax collection gap. Let's face it, in the East Africa community, only Rwanda is collecting more than, I think, 17% tax to GDP rate. Rwanda is the exception. And the reason why Rwanda does that is because you go to a small shop and you're buying airtime in a very, very tiny shop, and there's an EBM machine, which is an electronic billing machine. So whatever little thing that you're buying is actually swiped, it's tagged by the government as a transaction, and they get their little tax in there, and that's why the tax to GDP has gone north of 17%. Are we doing enough to appreciate the tax gap? No, I wouldn't say we are. That is a very, very huge problem that we have in the media space. We are obsessed with debt to GDP level, and even in that debt to GDP level, our huge fascination is with external debt at the expense of domestic debt.
I know, my final question to you, it's going to be budget week in the coming week. And it's really important to watch how the media behaves in going into budget week. There's many people who've not been working for 3 months, and they're looking forward to that budget because it's the only fiscal tool government has at the moment to tame expectations of individuals or even the public at large. How should you, in your own view, how should the media behave in reporting the budget? Because we clearly understand now that we missed the ball on the state of the nation.
I think more questions need to be addressed on the fiscal tools. Now, monetary tools, we could easily talk about the repo rates, interest rates. Communication has been now appreciated monetary policy-wise. Monetarists like me, we now appreciate communication as a tool in monetary policy. Now, the fiscal side of things also has its own tools. You could definitely go onto the budgetary side, but the other thing that I am very, very keen on us appreciating is it's not enough to always pump money. There is things like deferments, there's things like deferred tax assets that I mentioned. These are things that we need to keenly be investigating and waivers. You know, if an investor is coming from a foreign country and coming to invest in Uganda, that is a fiscal tool that they give him, and they waive off tax for over, 5 years. Now, why can't you accord that to a domestic Ugandan like Raymond, who's starting a small business that is employing 30 people? Those are questions that fall into the fiscal side of things. You understand? That is not a problem of the UIA and what. We need structural reform at the institutional level. We need massive structural reform. You open up a 1 minute window to open up a business, that's great. Countries are now doing all of this on the phone. That is all reform. So we need structural reform. That is something that needs to be very, very keenly looked at by the media. We need deferments. We need waivers. Waivers are the most important thing. At a time like this, the great lockdown is here. The last time we had a depression of this, a recession of this magnitude was 1929, the Great Depression. And as it stands right now, we need to throw all tools out there. It's not enough to say we've cut interest rates on the monetary side and then we sit back. There's only so much Mutaviti can do at Bank of Uganda. This has to be a five-pronged approach. The monetary side, the fiscal side, but the media's appreciation of all of this, that's the question that we need to answer, Raymond. And maybe that's the kind of thing that we need to be looking at on the show. So just to answer your question in a very, very brief manner, we need waivers. We definitely need deferments, because much as I see that URA is in a tough spot, if you are bringing in, let's say, a machine that's going to help in this import substitution drive for the country and hasten the process of boo-boo, question is, why are you paying taxes? Because at the end of the day, exports are going to go up at the expense of imports, cut down on a balance of payment position and a balance of trade position, and you are doing your part as a Ugandan. And ultimately, this is reflected on GDP figures. So why then are you paying taxes? So we need structural reform to appreciate such things.
It will be interesting to watch how the press behaves covering the budget address this week. But now let's take a very quick break. When we return, we talk about the morning shows on radio. Radio is the biggest disseminator of news in Uganda. In fact, it's the most held asset within which the media talks to its population. Now, this week, we choose to focus on the morning radio show, which is one of the highest listenership areas of Uganda's population. How do the morning shows influence and impact the consumption of the media, but also how do the morning shows stem the expectations of the public from its government and also very broadly from the media?
Today seems to be a very slow start. Stephen Bide is on the ground in Nansana. Good morning, Stephen.
My role in on the morning show, I think, is to bring love and happiness. So I try to do that with my voice. I try to do that even when we do share stories. You try to find a little spark in something. And I think waking up to joy and, warmth. I like to think that in the morning we are your first hug through your ears. So I try to ensure that everything I say, everything I do is in that regard. So sometimes these hugs are tight, sometimes the hugs are fuzzy and warm, and sometimes they make you laugh, they tickle you. So yeah, something like that.
Working on TV and radio especially radio is so different from TV. And I realized that actually not many people actually Google or have information there. I think it's a misconception that everyone news is everywhere and the people are getting it right away. No, So our role as broadcasters is to really make people aware of the news. That's it, because they actually don't look for news. So for us as the morning show, if something happened even if something happened at 7 p.m. and I heard it, the different perspective that we give makes our audience understand it much better, appreciate it much better. And because we also try to get people up and running in a good mode, we give a little spin to it that changes the way you look at it, the way you perceive it, the way you see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think during COVID-19, we've played a significant role. First of all, we are not just showing off, but we are the only radio show that actually stayed on air even after the lockdown. You know, a couple of our friends that work at other stations would call you like at 5 a.m. and ask you, how are you on air? Like, we are on air. And so for about 3 days of the first those first few days, we were here, and we have not given up on our audience, regardless. And we have made the information simpler. We are the people who break down these very tough concepts to grasp to our listeners, to our viewers, and we say it through jokes, through songs. Now, for us on the show, we have an instrumental on the show. Yeah, Sauti Sol's Susanna. And we sing about, you know, the different scenarios.
Yeah.
Like, oh, Corona, I hope you're happy now. I see you're killing Americans and you're leaving us. But Corona. And when it started killing Black Americans, African Americans, because there was the narrative that Corona doesn't attack Black people. We said, excuse me. We sang about it, and we break down those simple things. Yeah, we have a song about truck drivers.
Yes.
Yeah, everyone.
I think we've played a big role in curbing anxiety, giving people information, especially because we've allowed people to explore their feelings. We take a lot of phone calls, more than we need to be honest, more than we are instructed to, but allowing people to explore how they feel about it, airing out their voices. Sometimes your thought doesn't manifest until you put it out there. It stays in your head and maybe you don't understand how you feel about a certain situation, but we've allowed people to do that. We've had conversations that are seemingly, you know, minute things that people would normally brush off. I think something as simple as how are you today? We added a segment on the show where we just let people call in and tell us, how are you doing? Just talk to us, tell us how are you. And then even just
corona bikutwala,
you know.
Yes.
So things like that, encouraging people to explore how they feel, encouraging people to share their grievances. We've had people be helped on air. So there's people who call in, they're like, yo, I'm struggling, like in 2 weeks I know my food is going to be over, and you know, these people share these phone numbers and people help. People reach out. People have sort of allowed the Mighty Breakfast to be a community of hope and encouragement, mostly. Yeah. It's not going anywhere. It might transform. It might take different forms, like podcasts. I think also, I think short WhatsApp audios shall be called podcasts from now henceforth. But yes, I think even with all the forms that it takes, I don't think radio is going anywhere. And I think radio, depending on how we, the people who are still on it, treat it and cultivate it, it still has an opportunity for so many people and to develop. And I think the role of radio is to make sure that we're on the same page as a country. Because whether the station is in Kampala, whether the station is in Arua, whether the station is in Soroti, we need to be on the same page. And I think that's the role of media in general. But what radio does is actually add a voice to it, add a personality, add a connection, add a whole life, a whole persona, so that people can, you know, tune in and listen to, oh, Mr. Mulondo's children are also losing teeth and this is happening with them. Oh, Maritza's life or her hair is falling out and this is probably because of this.
She eats a lot of mandas.
Nonsense.
Yeah.
So, please, fake news. So it's always nice to make sure that people feel people feel they can relate to you, and on top of that, understand that, you know, we're all in this thing together. And then listening to perspectives of other people, just the idea of being on the same page is very important for a country.
But also conversations on radio must now transform to, you know, they need to have the capacity to have to transform policy, to influence policy, you know. And I'm excited about, for example, when I say an investigative story, yeah, and it changes policy. And I think that's what radio conversations is to start. You know, when you hear people doing Senga things, it's great, but yeah. President thinks that giving a TV to a village will actually help. 2 TVs and a radio. Do you think this kind of distance learning is effective? If you are in education, you can also tell us what can work and what do you advise schools to do in this time as they wait for the time that government has set for schools to be fully functional. We have actually influenced policy. You know, we did hashtag stay in your lane. It started on DMIT breakfast, and we're able to see that done across the entire country. We did warning awards where we're asking people, calling people to actually clean their homes, start having all these, you know, toilets and all. KCCA jumped on board and they did the Weyonje campaign. That is policy, yeah? We need to have radio to get to that level. The playing music, the humor, that's part of the package, but it needs to have that impact. And for us here, every day we strive to do that. So we talk about things that are hilarious, but also things that are serious. Education, yeah, health, oil and gas, infrastructure, taxes, whatever influences. And we put, we ask the tough questions to power. We hosted the Minister here of Health at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was crazy how, you know, some questions were she was unable to answer some of these questions. And for us, we are happy when now when she gets out of this place and she goes to wherever she's going and says, when I was in KFM, this and this happened, and we need to, you know, for us, we always shout on the show, we won. And it's not just our win as Maritza and Brian, it's a win for the people who we speak for, who are our listeners.
Thank you so much for watching the Fourth Estate this week. Of course, our job here is to critique what the media does, and for now we're doing that mostly from our homes until we're able to come back to you from the studio. But now, every week we get to leave you with something that was trending online. And this week, one of the biggest measures of intelligence in the world is how well the command of the English language is. Or at least that's the perception of intelligence.